Okay, everyone. We've given them about 3 minutes to join. The stragglers can join afterwards. To kick it off, you are free to type messages to the panelists and they will respond if and where possible. On the call with us is Mandana Moshiri and Jim Bycroft and Chris Rock. Will probably join a little bit later. I'm Louis Bernardo. I'm SIEMonster's Senior Security Architect. I help customers with the implementations, configurations, and customizations in general, what they need, and help with training, etc., to set up the environment so that they can get the best from it. Mandana is our Enterprise Sales Director, and she is able to answer any sales queries you may have or licensing queries, etc. Her contact details are displayed on the screen. I will also be emailing out the slides at the end of the webinar. From the technical side, from a panelist perspective, Chris Rock will join a little bit later. Jim Bycroft, who's our lead solutions designer, is online and available to answer any queries about the topics that we're discussing tonight, should you have any questions relating to that. Okay. So tonight's discussion is going to lead primarily around enabling Syslog on the professional and community editions. This is a question that has come up quite often in the forums as well as through customer queries, etc. So we thought we'd just generate a quick webinar on how to enable this and then follow that up with 2 more webinars, one to create decoders and one to create the rules. The implementation considerations that you have to bear in mind when looking at this is today's training is purely focused on the architecture around the community edition and the professional edition, and the difference between those editions and the enterprise and MSSP editions is obviously the Kubernetes backend. So there are different configuration items that needs to be applied there. We will probably do a webinar for that services or for those services at a later stage as well. The biggest architectural differences is with the Kubernetes, it's multi-tiered. So you've got multiple nodes with load balancers and services running, whereas the professional and community editions are all single instance installs. Other things to consider when deploying Syslog into the environment is where your destination sits. So for example, if you have a professional edition that's sitting in AWS, if you open Syslog, it is recommended that you have at least a VPN tunnel of sorts that's between your source and destination points, because Syslog traffic by its nature is not encrypted, and there could be sensitive information contained in that when it's transferred. The types of traffic is also important. The solution supports multiple types of log ingestion, etc. Some of them are encrypted and intended to be used in open public networks, and others like Syslog is not. So just bear that in mind when you deploy it. Then there's also mechanisms for traffic control, firewalls, routers, load balancers, etc., that you have to bear in mind. So if you have large volumes of syslogs and you have a professional instance, you might want to put some kind of caching facility in the middle that can capture the traffic and then pass it along to the environment, depending on your internet connection speed, etc. In cases like that, we generally suggest that you have a Hydra appliance on premise, which will allow you to transfer the syslog over the link via a VPN connection. Some of the questions that have come up was the persistence of configuration changes in the community edition and the professional edition. The solution was designed with robustness in mind to ensure that accidental changes to the environment doesn't cripple it, so that there's a mechanism to recover it. So there are some steps that you need to perform to ensure that you can make changes for testing purposes. And if something should break, you can just restart the container and those changes will have reverted, so that it ensures that the most reliable way can be implemented going forward. Sorry about that, a bit of a mic glitch. So with robustness in mind, there are certain aspects that you need to bear in mind. You can do testing in the environment by editing certain files, but if you want to make it persistent, you have to add those configuration to other items as well. The basic log flow is the following. It's your syslog source that goes to your physical network interface on your VM, or on the host and then to your VM. It will then verify that the port is listening, which it will then pass on to the container port mapping, which will in turn give it to the service. If at any point in this flow it fails, it will just ignore the traffic. If it gets to the final one, it will go to processing, which will then process the syslog data received, etc. For your traffic control with syslogs, etc., when you open the syslog, it will accept syslogs on the host port by default from any IP address. Something that you could do to control this is to set firewall rules. This can be done on appliances, FortiGate, Cisco's, all of them supports this. You can control which endpoints are allowed to send syslog to the environment. You can also do local on the device. The latest build of SIEMonster is an Ubuntu base, and it supports firewalls from UFW as well as IP tables, whichever one you feel more comfortable with. Then on the Wazuh side, you also have to set the allowed IPs, which means that you can set the configuration up to that level. So there's multiple considerations on each level of the flow of traffic. Okay, so when I spoke about persistent and non-persistent earlier, you'll see that when you edit changes directly in the osec.conf, which is the primary active configuration file in Wazuh, and you restart the container, it will revert all of those. This is by design. There's a secondary location which it draws the configuration from that is permanent, and that is this location from the config mount perspective. Then the Wazuh manager service, which is a systemd service file that we've created that starts the service. It has predetermined configuration items that you need to adjust to allow for syslog ingestion. And this is also not persistent once the host reboots. To change that, you will need to adjust your user data file, which I will show you as when we go through the technical side of things. So the first step is to adjust the container service to allow for the traffic flow to get into the environment. Some of the tools that you will need to have for testing purposes is tcpdump. This is already installed on the host. You can install this inside the container very simply by using apt install tcpdump. As well as you need to look at your firewalls and traffic control measures that you've got between the source for the syslog and the destination for the syslog. The container config needs to be adjusted by adding the ports that you want to use. The default ports for this is obviously port 514 UDP, and TCP, you don't have to specify the protocol because that is the default. Again, TCP dump, firewalls, and traffic control is important. Then from an osec.conf configuration item, you need to add to the remote function to allow for syslog traffic to come in, and you specify the port and the protocol, as well as the allowed IP ranges. Please note that this might change depending on your internal environment. That is my lab environment's IP range, and that is why I've added it there. You can check 4 blocked IPs in your ossec.log, which I will show you as well. And if you have any blocks appearing there, you can obviously add additional lines below this one that says allowed IPs. You can then test your data flow by enabling log all JSON and log all in general. The difference between the two is the previous one will just capture the traffic that is being sent to it on Syslog. The second one will also include additional information like the decoder information and additional classifications that the system has already applied to it when it logs it. I will show you examples of both of that. These can be found under the archive log with that pass part. So the most important thing when you get to this step is to realize that grep is your friend. The more proficient you are with grep, the quicker you'll get to the data that you need. The minute you enable these, it logs absolutely all traffic that comes into the host, regardless of what component of Wazuh it is intended for. So it will capture both the syslog as well as your remoted logs, your syscheck logs, and your agent logs, etc. Even the ones that are classified as below level 3, which is usually discarded by Wazuh. So with that, I'll jump over to the SSH session. You'll see that I'm logged onto my community edition. First step is always sudo -s. The Docker container services, etc., are all configured to be dealt with from a root user perspective. And the reason for that is that there are less holes if you do not add the extra configurations to allow all users to access those services. As discussed, you have to adjust the Wazuh manager service first. As per systemd specifications, everything is under etc systemd system. If you do an ls-lah, you'll see there's quite a few services listed here that's been configured to automatically start. This is essentially all the components that forms the cohesive SIEMonster and provides the interface to you. You can edit the Wazuh manager service, and you can see that there are pre-existing lines there. And as per the screenshot, you just need to add 2 lines above that. So you can copy those 2 lines, go down one level, paste them. You change them to the ports you need. Press escape, WQ for write quit, and that's the configuration change done. For those of you that want to take a screenshot, you can do so now. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay. Once that is done, you have to do systemctl daemon reload. This reloads the configuration file for the systemd subcomponents. And at this stage, you have to restart the container to allow the traffic to flow. So that's system control. Restart Wazuh manager. Depending on the hardware that you have, this could take a few seconds to a few minutes. And there you go. One thing that you need to do before you get to this point is redirect your syslogs to the server already to make sure that the flow has been established to this endpoint before you start building up the other configuration items, because there are specific types of hardware, appliances, etc., that need specific ports. So if you do the default port setup and your appliance doesn't allow for it, then you have to redo all the configuration. So it is important to get your flows to run to your machine first. You can test the flows by doing a tcpdump UDP port 514, because I'm using UDP port 514, and I can just see if the traffic is flowing. It takes a little bit of time to start up, especially if you're doing a blanket item like I am there. The alternative is you can also add -A, capital A, which will output the results in ASCII. If you remove UDP before port, it'll give you TCP. Okay. So to get into the container now, you do a docker exec -it, Wazuh manager, and bash, because bash is the default shell for that container. Bearing in mind that a lot of the containers are based off of Alpine Linux, and they do not have born again shell. They've got Alpine shell, which is just short for, or shortened to ash if you want to get into those containers. You're in your container now. You can see that tcpdump is not installed. You can quickly do tcpdump. It's a small file, and it should install very quickly. And now you can also do tcpdump UDP port 514 -a inside your container. You can see that my traffic is coming through successfully. So we're all good there. So now we can do our configuration of the Wazuh. Now, obviously, we're not going to do the persistent configuration until we've at least tested it. So we do var ossec, etc., ossec.conf. You'll see that there's no color coding in this file. It's because the extension is .conf. To enable the syntax highlighting, you need to do set file type equals XML. And now you have your color coding available so that if you make any typographical errors, it will immediately show it. Just to give you an idea, if I do that, you can see it changes the color coding, which means that that function won't work. The same with if you add an item like that. So you usually add the remoted option below. So there are 3 lines that I've added below that. So now we'll just, you can either copy and paste the items that you want to add, or you can just quickly type it out if you want. So I'll just quickly type it out. Tabulation is not really important, but it makes it easier to troubleshoot if you stick to a specific format. You can see that the XML is basic. You need to close any commands that you add. So I've opened a connection there. So I need to close the connection configuration. That's if my spelling works tonight. There we go. And it's port 5514. And the protocol is UDP. And we'll do allowed IPs /24. You can also do that on an individual IP. So you don't need to add the whole subnet if you don't want to. And finally, we close the remote. You can see your color format is correct. You check your spelling, that's correct. And your ports and your allowed IPs. You escape and :WQ for write quit. And one of the quickest way to check if the configuration works so that you don't break necessarily your Wazuh that's running and having to go and delete those lines again, you can just do var ossec bin, ossec log test. There are other mechanisms as well. So I've got a typo. That's XML. There we go. So now we need to find the typo. Protocol allowed IPs. For speed, I am going to copy and paste that configuration. To delete lines from a file like this, you simply press DD until you've removed all the unwanted ones. And in Putty, you can just right-click and paste. And right quit and log test. Now it functions. So obviously I made a typographical error somewhere, and that's why it's important to use the testing functionality before you put it into production. So now that we know it works, we can do var OSSEC control restart. This won't restart the container. It just restarts the OSSEC/Wazuh services inside the container, and it allows for you to test it before you apply the permanent changes. Again, depending on the speed of the environment that you're running this on, it can take anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes for this change to be effected. Now, you want to check if the port's running, but you will find that netstat isn't available. So you do apt install nettools, which is also a tiny package and should install very quickly. And then you just do netstat minus PULUNT, and it will show you all the ports that are listening. And there you can see my container is now listening on port 514. So the next step is you've confirmed that you're receiving your traffic to your host machine. You've reconfigured the Wazuh manager service so that the container starts up with the mapped ports. And you've reconfigured your internal Wazuh manager configuration to listen on UDP port 514. So that means that you've validated your traffic all the way through into the system. The next step in the process is to enable log all so that you can actually capture the logs that are coming through. To do this, you go back into your ossec.conf. Set your file type to XML. And here you can see your alerts.log, and there's your log all and your log all JSON. So all you do is you change these two to yes, and you restart the service. Okay, we can confirm just for safety that the service is still listening, and you can see that it is. And now you can go to var ossec logs, archives, and you can see that the two files are there. If you want to see if they're growing, you can do watch space minus N1, which will mean it'll refresh a command every 1 second. Do ls minus lah, and you can see if they're growing or not. If you have a low data flow through there, it won't grow fast. This is a lab environment with limited machines pointing to it, but in a large corporate environment where you've got firewalls, syslogs, etc. pointing to this, that file could become gigs and even terabytes in a very short period of time. So be careful using this function. Only use it when you need to. Alternatively, spin up a community edition that's sequestered from the rest of the items where you can point your logs to so that you can test it before you implement it in production. So if you do a tail minus F of archives.log, it will show you the traffic that's being captured currently. And you can see that there's a lot of traffic that isn't necessarily specific from the source that you've wanted. Now, in my case, I know, for example, that the source that I wanted is a Ubiquiti Dream Machine. So I would have to go and find it in this environment. You can also see that items like this could mean that the traffic isn't allowed because of the container setup or your local LAN, etc. So it is very simple to take that and you edit your OSSEC again. And you find your allowed IPs and you can add it in there. So first things first, set file type. This is a bit of a muscle memory exercise. It is important to do so that you ensure that you minimize the risk of typos. I want to add that one. And I close it again. Do that. It is important to note all the changes you make so that when you do go to production, if you have a separate test environment, that you've got all the data you need for your change controls and for your policies and procedures, etc. It also helps because sometimes if you repeat steps too often, you forget to write them down and realize that they're part of what needs to happen. And this will make sure that you don't lose track of any of those. So if we look now, we can tail that same file and we can see we're not getting any more deny messages. So that functioned correctly. And you can see that my traffic is coming through successfully. The next step of the webinar with the next session is obviously on how to break that down. I'll give you a slight little preview. It's very simple. If you look at the events coming through, you'll see that they are structured in a very specific way. And you can see that that is the prefix. So it tells you what fed the information. So what you need to look for is everything after that. So you carefully select that. And then you do var OSSEC bin, OSSEC log test. Same one you use to check if your configuration will function. And you paste it in there. And you can see no decoder is matching. So with the next webinar, we are going to go on with how to decode that, how to split the data into the various fields, and how to create rules and alerts based on the data that we're receiving. This data specifically here, just to give you an idea. The first IP is usually the closest IP in the Syslog traffic chain or hops. So if you have multiple firewalls, routers, NATs, etc., that it goes through, it will get to a point where that final IP before it gets to the host or the host's internal Docker network may be the final one. You will then see that one. The next one is the obvious, the Syslog timestamp, which is normal. In this case, that item there is the serial number of my UDM. There's the kernel version. There's the subversion. And then it's got basically the interfaces, the MAC address, source address, destination address, packet length. There's also TTLs, the protocol that was used, source port, destination port, etc. So some of those are important, some of those are not. It's important to learn the traffic that you're analyzing so that you know which ones are important, which ones you need to break out, and which ones will become useful to you from an alerting and documentation point of view for capturing all that information. So it's the brief introduction. If you have any questions, feel free to type them and we can cover them from there. Matt spotted my typo. Quite a few spotted it. Cool. Are there any questions that you guys want answered or shown? We've got some time left. I made sure that there was ample time left if you had specific questions about specific components in this. Matt. Okay. Wazuh does not encrypt syslog unless it is picked up by the agent itself. So you can install the agent on your remote Linux hosts, your Windows hosts, and your Mac host, and it can pick up syslogs from those, and that traffic is encrypted. But sending it via syslog functionality in your appliances usually cannot be encrypted, no. Some of the later appliances, however, does have SSL encryption available, but most of those vendors have chosen to use their own implementation for that, which other vendors don't support. So it's a tricky situation. If you've got an appliance that has that functionality, we can always test it with you. It's we're very adaptable, so, and that's one of the benefits of the open source community and the tool sets that we use. Any more questions? I'll take that as a no, unless somebody's typing a very long question. The information that was presented today will be recorded or is being recorded, so feel free to review the recording after the fact.
There's a question from Matt Dennison.
Oh, there we go. How do you manage a Wazuh agent mass deployment with endpoint manager verification? Can you clarify that, Matt? From an endpoint manager verification, I'm just trying to determine exactly what you want to measure there. Mass deployments can be done via various mechanisms. Wazuh agents can be installed via single lines. I've got extra material on our YouTube channel, Wazuh deployment. There's 3 parts to it. You can watch through those. You can deploy that with various orchestration like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, GPOs. There's quite a bit that can happen. Are you talking about, you're talking about the SSL verification. So host verification settings can be enabled. You just need to register your own certificates. The documentation is available on how to do that. Most clients, however, don't want the bother of managing those certificates, etc. So we leave it optional. We do not enforce it. But it is fully supported on our version. We're currently on version 3.12, not 3.13. But it has been available since, I believe, version 3.6 of Wazuh. But I'm speaking under correction there. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? I know there were some questions with the Q&A for the registration, etc. I tried to cover off as many of them during the intro, especially considering persistence of configurations, etc. So I said that I would show you how to make those persistent as well. So I can do that quickly. If you look in the environment, when you inside the container, you can go to Wazuh config mount. You'll see that that's just one of my testing files. So that folder entirely is persistent. If you go to etc., there's your permanent osec.conf. So once you're sure that your osec works on a var osec etc osec.conf, you can copy it into this. And the reason we do it this way is it ensures that you always have a working copy of the file in the right location. So when the container starts, it will read this configuration and it will deploy it to the var osec etc conf osec.conf file. So by doing the copy that I've just done, I've made my changes persistent to the environment, and it will withstand any reboots of the container or the host. From another point of view, the bulk of the configuration to remain persistent is under the user data. Now, the core OS one is in a different location, but our latest version is under user data itself. So the difference is user data for Ubuntu and user data for core OS. If you don't remember the location of the file, you can simply go locate user data, and you can see that it's the no cloud one. So you can edit that file, and you will see that it contains all your base configuration for the entire platform. So if you want to make your Syslog, your services configuration for the Wazuh manager permanent, the only thing that you need to do is you type / for searching, you do Wazuh manager.service, and you can scroll down and you can see there are the ports that you need to focus on, and you can simply add these in. Okay, so one thing that's very important to remember here, this is a YAML file. If you use a tab anywhere in this file, you will corrupt it. It will no longer function. Do not use tabs. Always use spaces. You can set that as a consistent effort throughout all the configuration files of the environment, and that will make sure that you don't accidentally use a tab. Finding a tab in a document like this could be quite problematic because there may be tabs inside inverted quotes, not as a prefix. So it is best to just not use tabs at all, and to make a conscious note of avoiding it. You can see here that the configuration has been added for 514 UDP and normal. You can see I've repeated or set my lines to go on to the next one, and all the color coding is correct. So press escape, right Q, and now your changes are persistent. Okay, Jason, just to answer these directly. Basically, you don't sign the agent. You provide host verification keys for the agent. So there's a process by which you create a certificate on the Wazuh manager. And then when you install the agent has to have both the MSI or Debian package or RPM package or Mac package. And it's got to have the certificate with it. And when you install it, you point it via switches to the certificate, and it will then validate that host is allowed to register to your host. This is especially useful if you have internet-facing Wazuh registrations, if needed, but it is not required. You can also set a password if that's simpler for smaller companies that don't want to maintain a certificate grouping or configuration limits on the certificates. So there are various options available through that, but you don't actually sign the agent. No, it's just passed as it's similar to when you do an SSH authentication with certificate key pair. So it's the same process to that. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So I've shown you the persistent side of things as well. Are there any other questions? Okay. So with the data flows established, you can start looking at the traffic that you're capturing already. and you can start identifying the items in your traffic that you want to capture as individual fields. And when we do the next webinar, we'll continue on from here. So we'll start with the captured traffic, identify the components that are important, and then start building the decoders for them. This will be regex based. So if you have some regex knowledge, it will help. If you do not, then there are some links that would be beneficial to just have a look at before the next session. I'll share those with the PowerPoint slideshows as well. Okay, so if there are no further questions, then I'll bid you all farewell and have a great evening further.